Hi everyone, my name's Elizabeth, welcome to another video, and today is the start of what is going to be a really interesting, kind of tragic, but also I'm hoping inspiring marine story about this habitat, which is one of the most degraded marine ecosystems in the entire world, with 95% of the habitat being lost in the UK and 85% of it being lost around the world. The habitat that I am standing on right now. Now, for this tale that I'm going to tell you today, for this information, I need you to understand that it's going to be in two separate parts. For the first part, I'm going to be using where I'm standing now to show you what oyster reefs do, why they're important, the incredible life that you can find in there. But I need you to continue watching to the second part because it kind of takes a turn at the end and you need to understand both sides of the story, because when you dig a bit deeper, potentially actually this very reef, this oyster reef is part of the problem that is actually killing oyster reefs itself. Now, I know that doesn't make too much sense to you, but I hope that you stick with it because hopefully by the end it will. But for now, let's focus on the incredible life that you can find here on oyster reefs and why you should care about protecting them in the first place. So in my other videos on the Isle of Sheppey, and that is where we are now, I have been exploring literally the beach that is just maybe 100 metres, if not a bit more, that way, which is a completely sandy shore environment. There are plenty of videos on my channel that you can check out showing you the life that is found on sandy shores just down the road from this oyster reef, but it will also help you to understand just how different these two ecosystems are. This is much different. It's hard, it's full of pools, it's raised up, and that is because of the oysters themselves. And really it is the oysters themselves that are causing this incredible habitat to exist. Okay, I get that that's kind of self-explanatory with the fact that it's an oyster reef, but I want to place emphasis that the fact that it is the oysters themselves, the shellfish in this reef system, that is causing the rest of the life to be here and to be different. Species have such a impact on an environment, on an ecosystem, when they themselves, that organism, can either change the way the habitat behaves, change the way the life that's there, for better or worse, they are called ecosystem engineers. And it kind of makes sense because they engineer this ecosystem. Without the oysters being here, this habitat wouldn't exist. The reason oysters are such good ecosystem engineers is that they provide a hard surface in what is normally a soft sediment kind of area. That means the species such as barnacles, seaweeds, chitons, all these different creatures that need a hard surface to settle on are going to be found here and not on the sandy shores as much, or if at all, because they don't have anything to grip onto that's going to be permanently in one place. Nestled on the oysters, you can find barnacles, mussels, great big clumps of seaweed, including coral weed, which is named after coral reefs because they form a calcium carbonate skeleton, a really rare find down in the southeast of England. Gorgeous tube worms are feeding, anemones can be found, colonies of tiny animals called bryozoans all huddled together living on the surface of oysters, and even periwinkles are happy because it is a great surface for them to go along and eat all the lovely tiny little particles of food off the top of. Also are a great nursery ground. The fact that there is a hard structure, it gives them little nooks and crannies to hide in. From sand gobies to shrimps to scuttling crabs, sand eels and scale worms. The oyster reefs are full of curious and wonderful marine life. That means the oyster reefs are feeding into the wider sea world. They're supporting life and biodiversity far further than the couple of hundred square metres that this oyster reef takes up on the seabed. I mean, what incredible wildlife we are finding right here in this, compared to the entire coastline, compared to the entire ocean, tiny bit of the sea. It's worth mentioning that maybe compared to some of the rockpooling videos you've seen of mine, there are less species, but you have to bear in mind the location that we are in. If you can see the docks over there, that is the end of the Isle of Sheppey, and down there is the River Medway. If you look just behind that, you'll see a bit of land. That is basically Essex and the entrance to the River Thames. That means there's a lot of freshwater output coming out into the Isle of Sheppey, and technically the Isle of Sheppey is still part of the Thames estuary, which means that you're only going to be dealing with species here that have a tolerance for a bit of lower salinity. Oysters are also particularly fantastic because they are filter feeders and they are very good at filtering. That means that to feed, they suck in the water and the sea, and they take out the nutrients and the tiny phytoplankton and plankton in the water to feed themselves. By doing so, they're also taking out nutrients that can be harmful. Things like a lot of excess nitrogen can actually cause a lot of pollution. They can cause a lot of species loss if it gets too high, and this is one of the environments in the sea that regulates it. It cleans water, and an individual oyster, one of these guys can filter up to 200 litres of water every single day. So these guys are not only changing the seabed, the surface, they are changing the sea around them too. Just look at this crystal clear seawater for filming. Thanks, oysters. Not to mention the fact that you've probably all heard of oysters as that really fancy food that you get at restaurants. Oyster beds are really important, and oysters are really important commercially, which actually plays in a lot to this tale of the oyster story, I suppose, that I'm sharing with you. But it's worth recognising that oyster beds and reefs provide a lot of money because oysters cost a lot of money. In fact, oysters are worth about 10 million to the UK economy every year. But I promised you, I suppose, a twist in the tale. And it starts with telling you about why and how oyster beds got so unbelievably degraded. So oyster beds used to be found throughout the UK. I mean, I'm down in the southeast of England now, where it's pretty much the only few places in the entire country you can now find oyster reef beds. I live in Dundee, near the Firth of Forth, and that used to be a site that used to get 30 million oysters in every year. They used to be found all around the country, but in the last 200 years in the UK, 95% of our native oyster beds have been completely demolished. They've just disappeared. So much so that these wonderful oyster beds and reefs are classed as functionally extinct. Now what that means is that without human interaction, without human help, these species aren't going to be able to survive on their own. Native oysters in the UK can't continue to survive without restoration projects where people are breeding native oysters and reintroducing them back into areas where they should have been before. I just want to pause and let you take that in. 95% of all the oyster reefs have gone in the last 200 years. People are known to have used oyster reefs for food, for fisheries, since the Stone Age. And in the last 200 years, 95% of them have gone. They lasted all that time, and then they didn't. Now why is that? Why have native oysters suffered so much? And also, why do we not hear more about it? Why do we hear that coral reefs and rainforests are being destroyed? And I agree, we should hear about them and then we should educate them about that. But right here in the UK, we have a marine habitat that we have destroyed 95% of. And as a marine biologist, who is my job to know, I didn't even know that until I found this oyster reef and went, oh, let me look at some oyster reef facts. And my mind was absolutely blown. I am furious, both with myself for not knowing, and furious this isn't something that is shouted at everyone. Okay, it would be a bit weird if I went up to the street and started shouting at someone about oyster reefs, but you know what I mean? How can such an important habitat go and someone who is in that career as a marine biologist didn't know about it? Is it just me? Or is it just mine not knowing? Or is that just a bit messed up? I don't understand. So why is it that oyster reefs have been decimated so much? Well, firstly, it starts with the problem of overfishing. We were taking far too much oysters before they could have a chance to recover, to recuperate, to breed. And by overfishing, by taking too much, we just diminished populations. Also, by fishing wrong and habitat degradation, things like beam trawling, where a beam of basically metal is just dragged along a beach. One run of that would probably destroy this entire habitat. So destructive fishing methods really haven't helped oyster reefs. They were also unlucky in the sense that there was a parasite and a disease that swept through native oyster populations, which meant that they were seriously degraded as well. But I said you needed to hold on specifically about this reef, because one of the reasons that native oyster populations have become almost extinct in the UK is because of an invasive oyster species, which is actually the oyster species found here. Now the UK has one species of native oyster, Oyster Economics, and that is the species that reefs have been made extinct and threatened. And the Pacific oyster, which is part of the problem because it outcompetes native oysters. So if you have a reef of native oysters, Pacific oysters will do better. They can monopolize an area and they can take it over. So the species then basically, you know, if there is a native oyster reef, that will be lost to swap with Pacific oysters. Now the Pacific oyster was actually introduced by us on purpose. We did this in 1965 because they had lost a lot of the native oyster population, a lot of the economy, a lot of the fishery, a lot of the business, and so to basically replace what they had lost, they introduced the Pacific oyster. Now to introduce an invasive species is always a risk because invasive species often can outcompete and you can't predict what they're going to do to the environment. It could have massive negative consequences, but it was deemed risky enough to do it because firstly of the economic consequences, the economic losses that people had suffered, but secondly because the sea temperature at the time, it meant that if you put a Pacific oyster into the sea, it could grow but it couldn't reproduce, which meant you could man could basically put these oysters in, let them grow, sell them, but they knew they weren't going to spread. And then global warming happened. Sea temperatures around the world have been rising, and it's the same here in the UK, and that sea temperature rise from the 1960s to now, which in the space of the planet is not very long, pushed Pacific oysters over the threshold, which meant they could breed, and from there they spread and took over natural oyster reef populations. Now there may be a few common oysters here. Common oysters are rounder and have less of a wiggly ridge, but I would say that 99% of the oysters here have a really prominent ridge at the end and are longer, which is much more similar to the invasive type. And in fact around the UK you can really only find the Pacific oyster now, the invasive oyster, and it's only in the Thames estuary and in Colne, which is across the river, across the way. Then there is a restoration project where they're putting common oysters, our native oysters, back in to repopulate them. So you might point out the fact of, okay, you've just shown us though videos on the incredible wildlife and biodiversity that you can find in an oyster reef that is invasive. Yes, fair enough, I will give you that. That is a good point if you were thinking that. And it is true. I mean, Pacific oysters were put in for a reason. They do have economic value, they add to that. And yes, they are an ecological engineer still, they still make the reefs, they still promote biodiversity. So in that sense, it's not a lose-lose situation, but it is for the common oyster. Now you may think that it's not a problem if we still have oysters, if we still have these reefs, but firstly we have to remember that these species are actually taking over the very few native reefs that we still have. And you have to bear in mind, and I think just on a baseline level, that the loss of a species from a country, extinction of any creature on the planet, whether country level or globally, and remember these are suffering globally, it's just not acceptable. It's just not okay. We have let it get to the point where we are losing our own native species. And I think on a baseline level that shouldn't happen, and that should be enough to try and protect, to keep trying to restore, to maybe try and stop as much of the Pacific oyster spread as possible. And as you can see from these oyster beds, these are both oyster beds. These are also beds with mussels in. And one of the traits of this oyster species is that it actually can outgrow mussels as well. So it could threaten our mussel populations, which again are ecological engineers and is a whole new environment that it might threaten. On the same lines, Pacific oysters are really good at growing and can actually affect other habitats. So just because this is a really good environment doesn't mean that the sandy shore down the road is any less of a good environment. In fact, it plays its role within the sea, and there are other habitats that are protected that are being threatened by Pacific oyster reefs setting up, where there wouldn't have been an oyster reef there for hundreds and hundreds of years, if ever. And it's that habitat change that we can't predict, which means it's such an issue and such something that we really need to watch out for, and is a real shame. But I do want to end on a positive note. This is the reef, that's the sea wall, and behind that is a road. Literally just over the road is this incredible ecosystem, whether it is invasive or not. And it just goes to show that I didn't know this was here. Putting on your wellies, or my pink trainers as it is at home because I can't fit them in my suitcase, and going out to explore an environment, I have learned about this new ecosystem. I have learned about the things that are threatening it, and now I can help do what I can to protect it. I can research, I can look at the restoration projects, I can support them, I can do my part to try and, I suppose, help natural reefs if possible. And education and getting out and exploring is exactly what this channel is for. And I hope that you guys watching this will realise that this was just a free trip out. I learnt so much from this. It was a free trip out on Google. Everything I'm telling you is just Googling and exploring and experiencing. And so I feel like if I can keep sharing, if I can keep showing you this, if you guys can get out there and explore yourselves, imagine that next time an ecosystem intertidally that you can reach in your wellies is starting to become under threat. If we're out there, if we're looking for it, if we know what's normal and what's not normal, we could make a difference. And that is what this channel is all about. It's the idea of that shouldn't just be a road that you drive along every day. It should be a road that you cross and you come down the beach and you learn what is literally over the road from you on your local doorstep. And if we all become a little bit connected with nature, I really, really hope that I'm never in the position again, or generations in the future in the position again, that I am standing on a beach not very far from my home and saying that this ecosystem is almost extinct. Thank you so much for watching this episode of When the Tide Retreats. If you like this content and like learning more about the marine world, then please subscribe and share to support this channel and the messages that I am trying to share within this video.